Good morning. I'm Jim Palmer, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. Thank you for joining us online and in person from Hinckley Production Studios in Madison. We are honored to once again present to you the findings of our statewide survey of Wisconsin residents. This is our 7th annual poll, and as best as we can tell, we're the only law enforcement group in the nation that routinely conducts these polls to gauge public perception on a range of topics impacting law enforcement and the communities they serve. Year in and year out, we obtain invaluable insights as to how the public views our officers and the jobs that they do. Our annual polling effort also garners some tremendously helpful views on the upcoming issues and challenges facing our state and public safety. We undertake this effort each year as part of a proactive strategy to enable a constructive dialogue on these issues, and we genuinely appreciate your interest. For anyone that needs the poll summary or would like to read this year's poll report in its entirety, please feel free to contact me by email at palmer@wppa.com, and we'll be happy to provide it. Let's begin our overview of some of the poll's key findings, which loosely follows the summary handout that was sent out this morning. Each year that we've conducted this poll, we've asked residents to prioritize the services and programs provided by their state and local governments. And every year, including this one, the answer has been the same. Keeping our community safe from crime is the #1 priority for Wisconsinites over education, economic development, protecting the environment, and holding the line on taxes. We also track how white and non-white respondents see things, occasionally differently, and to what degree, and we have also found those results very, very informative. Here you'll notice that non-white respondents place a higher priority on safe communities than white respondents, 87% compared to 73%. That result is interesting, especially within the context of the response that we received to our next question involving community policing. Community policing has been a big topic over the years as a way to be more interactive with neighborhood residents and perhaps bridge the tense cultural divides that exist. This year, 72% of the respondents indicated that the police spend about the right amount of time in their neighborhoods. But if you break it down by race, the results are a little more interesting. Nearly 40% of non-white respondents say police don't spend enough time in their neighborhoods versus nearly 20% of white respondents. These results are particularly insightful, considering that there are those in some communities that have suggested that law enforcement spends too much time in minority neighborhoods. Our poll would seem to indicate something else entirely, that it's minorities in particular that want a greater police presence in their neighborhoods, but not necessarily in the form of additional officers alone. They want a greater law enforcement presence, and they want officers that are more directly familiar, involved, and engaged with the people in their neighborhoods. These results would seem to clearly reinforce the growing movement on the part of law enforcement agencies throughout Wisconsin to strengthen their community policing strategies. Every year we've asked people to indicate how their local police force is doing. This year, 83% of the respondents to our poll said they either strongly approved or somewhat approved of the job being done by their local police officers. As you can see, this has been fairly consistent over the years. Generally speaking, our poll indicates that older individuals are more likely to hold law enforcement in higher regard. The poll also suggests that women, at 53%, are more likely to strongly approve of their local police officers than males, who came in at 38%. When we break down the approval ratings of the police along racial lines, we find that 48% of the white respondents strongly approve of their police, whereas 27% of non-white respondents strongly approve. And that's quite a disparity. It's worth noting that this stark distinction has been evident since we began posing the question in 2015. But we believe that any effort to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities they serve is benefited when we recognize areas of concern. And clearly our poll identifies an area where law enforcement must continue to reach out and engage communities of color. Moving on, when we asked whether having a well-funded police force improves your quality of life, 83% said they agreed, and that's a pretty significant number. Again, we think it's interesting to note that when you break down the numbers by race, 68% of non-white respondents said they agreed, while a more significant number, 86% of white respondents agreed. This distinction would arguably seem to suggest that minorities in Wisconsin may place a higher premium on the manner by which local law enforcement does its job, as opposed to simply how well funded or how many resources law enforcement has at its disposal. In a question that we posed for the first time in last year's poll, we wanted to know whether people think the job of being a police officer has gotten more or less dangerous over the past 5 years. Similar to last year's result, we found that 42% of the public think the job has grown more dangerous, while 50% think it's pretty much stayed the same. Interestingly, when the WPPA conducted a survey of officers in Wisconsin just last year, 65% of officers indicated that their jobs were less safe than they were 5 years ago. And the survey results of our officers on this topic would appear to be reinforced by the fact that according to the U.S. Department of Justice, the number of officers assaulted in the line of duty is on the rise. As we have in the past, we again used our latest poll to pose a series of policy and law questions to shed light on some interesting topics, usually within the context of new laws being discussed or proposed. As the state's largest law enforcement group and one that spends a significant amount of time lobbying state lawmakers on issues related to policing and criminal justice, we find great value in being able to ascertain a sense of how the public feels about these issues and the challenges that we may have in advocating for them at the state capitol in Madison. One such proposal would allow law enforcement to temporarily take guns away from people that have been found by a judge to be a danger to themselves or others. Now, you may recall that Wisconsin's Attorney General Josh Kaul raised this issue in his inauguration speech early this year. Our poll found that 82% of the public favors such change, while only 16% oppose it. In light of the fact in which the public tends to be divided on issues related to gun control, both here in Wisconsin and across the country, we find these results very surprising. While the devil in any piece of legislation certainly lies in the details, our poll suggests a significant degree of support for this proposal. We also wanted to know what people thought about expanding mental health treatment programs as an alternative to prison. This has been a popular topic in the public discourse and in states throughout the United States. 86% of the respondents favored treatment over incarceration, with only 9% registering their opposition to it. Similarly, 82% of the respondents in our poll indicate that they favor reducing prison time for nonviolent criminal offenders, and only 14% oppose such a measure. The findings for this question and the one before it, to us, were somewhat surprising. Historically, it seems, many Wisconsin lawmakers have been reticent about enacting measures to create alternatives to prison, perhaps out of a fear that they will be viewed as soft on crime. Nonetheless, these results indicate a great deal of support for expanding mental health treatment programs over incarceration, and this may suggest why significant reforms along this line have been enacted in states controlled by both Republicans and Democrats alike. For several years, the WPPA poll has asked the public to weigh in on the issue of body cameras. The debate over law enforcement's use of body cameras continues to make the news, and more police agencies in Wisconsin are equipping their officers with this technology. Our 2019 poll again reflects tremendous public support for body-worn cameras, with 95% of the public in favor of them. This is the highest number that we've received in the 5 years that we've been posing this question. For the past 3 years, we've been tracking how people feel about the use of deadly force, their perceptions of those incidents, and the degree to which race may have been a factor. We then attempt to take some of those perceptions and compare and contrast them against the realities that we can demonstrate through our consistent collection of data. At present, the WPPA is the only entity in Wisconsin that collects data relative to officer-involved shootings, and we have found that standing those perceptions, or the perceptions that some people may have about those incidents, against the realities facing our officers, can serve to promote a more informed dialogue on these matters. We start this journey with a broader question about racism, asking, how much of a problem do you feel racism is in our society? The results have not changed much from last year, with a slight decrease of 34% saying it was a major problem, with 43% saying it was somewhat of a problem. Interestingly, a national poll conducted last year by NBC News indicated that 64% of Americans felt racism was a major problem in our society, which is significantly greater than in our poll results covering Wisconsin alone. Unlike the national NBC poll, we've taken a closer look at our state results, which demonstrate that 60% of non-whites think it's a major problem, while less than half of our white respondents, at 29%, think it's a major problem. This distinction is significant, and it highlights how different white and non-white Wisconsinites view what most people appear nationally to identify as a major challenge facing our nation. Within that context, we asked whether law enforcement officers' use of deadly force, we asked people, how much of the time do you believe it is necessary and justified? 56% of whites say always or most of the time, while only 27% of non-whites believe so. That such a large proportion of our non-white respondents appear to believe that most deadly force incidents are not justified is troubling, especially when you consider the data that we've collected regarding these incidents, which I'll discuss more in a moment. We again asked people this year to indicate whether they agreed or disagreed with this statement. Most of the people who are shot by law enforcement officers in Wisconsin are African American or members of a minority group. In general, more than half of the respondents to our poll appear to believe that minorities represent a majority of those shot by law enforcement officers, and the same was true in examining the results from both white and non-white respondents. In short, both white and non-white respondents appear to agree on this issue, and that is particularly troubling, given that the reality that most of the people shot by law enforcement officers in Wisconsin are in fact white. In 2018, 52% of the individuals shot by law enforcement officers were white, 32% were black, 12% were Native American, and 4% were Asian. By comparison, 70% of the individuals shot by law enforcement officers in 2017 were white. Similarly, we asked respondents for their sense as to how many of the individuals fatally shot by police were armed. 47% of the people thought all or most of those shot by police were armed. But the reality is that in 2018, 92% were armed when shot. In 2017, 100% of the people shot by the police were armed. These results suggest a significant misconception that needs to be corrected. The vast majority of those shot by Wisconsin's law enforcement officers are armed, and it's clear that the public doesn't appreciate that fact. Moving on, we waded into the hot-button issue of immigration and asked whether undocumented immigrants should be allowed to obtain a driver's license. This is an issue that has generated a great deal of discussion both nationally and at the state capitol in Madison, where Governor Tony Evers has proposed it as part of his state budget. According to our polling, 60% are opposed to the measure, with only 40% in support of it. And there were no significant differences by any demographic breakdown. Similarly, we posed this more restrictive question. Would you support or oppose allowing undocumented immigrants to obtain a driver's license if that license cannot be used to board a plane or vote? Surprisingly, the opposition to this proposal actually increased for some reason to 77%. Now, it's unclear whether using the term undocumented or the mere reference to boarding a plane struck a nerve with respondents, but we honestly attempted to pose an objective question and avoid phrases that might lead to one result over another. Regardless, the results on these immigration-related issues would seem to highlight a significant challenge facing the proponents of legislation on this driver's licensing issue. Lastly, at least for the purpose of this media presentation, we again used this year's poll to explore how people feel about the legalization of pot. Perhaps not surprisingly to anyone that has been following this issue nationally, the support here in Wisconsin appears to be growing, as 46% of the respondents favor the legalization of marijuana for both medical and recreational use, and this was actually an increase of 7% from just last year. According to our results, only about 16% of the public believes marijuana should not be legal in any form. This could pose a significant challenge to Wisconsin's law enforcement community, as groups like the WPPA have some serious concerns about legalizing marijuana here, especially if appropriate attention isn't paid to how our officers and sheriff's deputies are supposed to enforce the law should it come to pass. This concludes my presentation of the poll, but don't hesitate to contact us if you want the full report in its entirety. It will also be posted later today on our website at WPPA.com. At this time, we're happy to entertain any online questions that may have been posed, but you're also always welcome to contact me directly should you want to do that in another way. It sounds like we've answered all of your questions, and we're grateful for that. Again, you're welcome to contact me directly should you like to discuss this poll further. We're very excited about the results, and thank you again for your time.